2:15 in the morning. Central Iran. The American KH-11 spy satellite was already losing its digital grip on the Isfahan province. This was not the expected mechanical degradation of a multi-billion-dollar orbital asset. Someone on the ground had projected a high-energy surge directly into the optical sensor suite. It was a surgical strike designed to blind the eye of the National Reconnaissance Office at the exact moment a high-security convoy began to move. The air over the Iranian plateau was thin and freezing. Below the sightline of the blinded satellite, the lights of the Natanz enrichment facility appeared as a faint glow against the dark, jagged earth. This was not a routine transfer of material. The timing suggested a level of sophisticated orbital tracking that the Iranian military was not supposed to possess. They needed to know who had given the order to turn out the lights. 600 miles above the Earth, the satellite attempted to reset its primary aperture. The digital feed was awash of static and overexposed white noise. On the ground, the desert was a landscape of deep shadows and silence. 6 heavy transport vehicles emerged from a hardened underground hangar. They did not use headlights. The drivers wore high-definition thermal imaging goggles. They moved with a synchronization that suggested months of quiet rehearsal. 3,000 miles away, in a windowless room in Northern Virginia, a watch officer stared at a blank screen. The terminal displayed a single flashing notification: sensor saturation. The officer did not hesitate. He keyed the secure line to the Pentagon. He reported that the National Reconnaissance Office had lost eyes on the most sensitive nuclear site in the Middle East. The blackout window had begun. In the Iranian desert, Colonel Reza watched the last transport vehicle clear the perimeter fence. He was a man who valued precision over speed. He checked his watch. He knew the Americans would be scrambling to reposition a secondary satellite or a long-range drone. He had exactly 22 minutes before the next window of vulnerability opened. It was a narrow margin. It was enough. The convoy did not head for the main highway. Instead, the vehicles turned toward a stretch of salt flats that appeared impassable on any standard map. The sand here was packed hard by centuries of heat. It left no tracks. It offered no heat signature against the cooling desert floor. The colonel keyed his radio and gave a single-word command in Farsi: "Proceed." The mission was now invisible. The American military was operating in a vacuum of information. Every second the satellite remained blinded was a second where history could be rewritten in the dark. Strategic command centers across the globe began to flicker to life. Decision-makers were being woken up in Washington and Tel Aviv. They were all staring at the same empty patch of desert. The transport vehicles reached the center of the salt flats. They did not stop. They accelerated. Behind them, the energy source that had blinded the satellite began to pulse with a low-frequency hum. The ground seemed to vibrate. The air itself felt heavy with static electricity. The colonel looked up at the stars. He knew the eye would eventually open again. By then, the world would be looking at a ghost. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:22 in the morning. National Reconnaissance Office Headquarters, Chantilly, Virginia. The diagnostic screens in the primary watch floor began to cycle through emergency recovery protocols. A senior imagery analyst named Sarah watched the telemetry data packets returning from the Keyhole satellite. The high-energy saturation that had blinded the sensors was receding. It did not fade like natural interference. It snapped off. It was as if a giant shutter had been closed and then suddenly reopened. The National Reconnaissance Office team worked in a silence, broken only by the hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic tapping of keys. Sarah adjusted her headset. She spoke to the orbital mechanics desk. Status on the KH-11. "Are we seeing clear frames?" The orbital engineer responded. "The primary aperture is clear. We are receiving full spectrum imagery. Retasking to the last known coordinates of the Natanz convoy now." The main screen at the front of the room flickered. The deep black of the Iranian desert appeared in high resolution. The salt flats were visible. The thermal sensors mapped the cooling sand in shades of gray and blue. but the 6 heavy transport vehicles were gone. There were no heat trails. There were no tire marks on the hard-packed surface. It was as if the convoy had never existed. 2:25 in the morning. The Iranian salt flats. Inside the lead transport vehicle, the environment was heavy with the smell of ozone. The electronic warfare technician sat in the passenger seat. He looked at a handheld sensor sweep. He spoke to Colonel Reza. The American satellite is active. They are looking at the salt flats now. The colonel did not look back. And the signature. Is it holding? The technician nodded. The masking is complete. We are within the designated zone. If their sensors are working correctly, they see nothing but empty sand. Colonel Reza gripped the steering wheel. He knew the technology they were using was not entirely Iranian in origin. It was a gift from a partner who remained in the shadows. The masking field was designed to bend the very light and heat the American satellites relied on, but it required immense power. The batteries in the back of the transport were draining fast. They had less than 10 minutes of invisibility left. Back in Virginia, Sarah leaned closer to her display. She was not looking for the vehicles anymore. She was looking for what they had left behind. Wait. Check the thermal variance on the central salt. Flat. Zone 4, Bravo. The analyst next to her adjusted the filters. I see it. There is a circular patch of set ground that is 10 degrees colder than the surrounding sand. That is physically impossible. The sun set 6 hours ago. The ground should be uniform. The watch officer stepped forward. Is it a sensor ghost? Sarah shook her head. Negative. The satellite is calibrated. Something is suppressing the thermal energy in that specific circle. It is moving. It is moving at 60 miles per hour toward the western mountains. 2:28 in the morning. The Pentagon. The report reached the National Military Command Center. The duty officer looked at the live feed from the NRO. He saw the cold spot moving across the desert. It looked like a shadow cast by a cloud that was not there. He keyed the secure line to the United States Central Command. The officer spoke clearly. This is the Pentagon. We have a confirmed contact of interest. Location is Isfahan province. We have a visual anomaly that matches the movement of the missing nuclear convoy. We are requesting immediate drone redirection. Get a global hawk over that coordinate. Now. The order went out. Hundreds of miles away. A high-altitude drone began, a slow, banking turn over the Persian Gulf. Its sensors were already slewing toward the Iranian interior. In the desert, Colonel Reza saw the warning light on his dashboard flash red. The power was failing. The masking field was flickering. He knew the Americans were coming. He looked at the mountain range ahead. A massive stone face loomed in the dark. He keyed his radio. All units, prepare for transition. The eye is widening. The cold spot on the American screen suddenly began to pulse. Then, it shattered into 3 distinct signatures. 2:25 in the morning. The eastern foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Inside the lead transport vehicle, the air was thick, with the scent of ionizing radiation and scorched copper. This was the heart of the convoy. Colonel Reza sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on a monitor that displayed the health of the primary cargo. The container was not a standard lead-lined cylinder for uranium hexafluoride. It was a massive, rectangular block of black composite material, interlaced with silver cooling vanes that pulsed with a steady, blue light. The technician in the back spoke over the internal intercom. Colonel, the internal temperature of the core is rising. The masking field is drawing too much power from the stabilization units. If we do not vent the thermal buildup, the shielding will fail. Colonel Reza did not hesitate. Maintain the field for another 3 minutes. We are almost at the split point. The technician's voice was strained. The core is reaching 300 degrees Celsius. We are risking a localized breach. Hold, the colonel commanded. The Americans must see the division. If they do not believe the decoys are real, the mission is over. 2:27 in the morning. National Reconnaissance Office Headquarters. The primary watch floor was a hive of controlled intensity. Sarah pointed to the main screen, where the single cold spot had fragmented into 3 distinct thermal signatures. They were moving away from each other in a perfect radial pattern. One headed north toward the salt mines, one headed south toward the coastal plains. The third continued west, deeper into the rugged mountain passes. Sarah turned to the watch officer. "Sir, the signatures are identical. The thermal displacement, the speed, and the radar cross-section are a perfect match for the original Convoy vehicles. They are using high-fidelity electronic emulators." The watch officer gripped the back of her chair. "Which one is the real cargo?" "I cannot tell," Sarah admitted. "The satellite sensors cannot penetrate the masking. They all look like holes. In reality, we need eyes on the ground. We need the drone feed, 2:30 in the morning, over the Persian Gulf." The pilot of the Global Hawk drone sat in a climate-controlled trailer at an airbase in Qatar. He adjusted his controls, slewing the multispectral camera ball toward the coordinate provided by the Pentagon. On his screen, the Iranian landscape appeared in hauntingly clear detail. He saw the 3 shadows moving across the desert floor. The pilot spoke into his headset. "Control, this is Raven 4-1. I have visual on the 3 targets. Requesting permission to descend to 20,000 feet for a high-resolution synthetic aperture radar sweep." The controller's voice came back instantly. "Raven 4-1. You are cleared to descend. We need a density scan on those vehicles. Identify which one is carrying the heavy mass." The drone tilted its long, slender wings and began a steep dive into Iranian airspace. As it dropped through the clouds, the pilot switched the sensor to a gravity gradient mode. This was an experimental tool designed to detect dense materials like lead and uranium by measuring the minute changes in the local gravitational field. The pilot watched the data stream. "Control, I am getting a reading. Target north is empty. Target south is empty. Target west. Wait." The screen in the drone cockpit began to pixelate. A series of vertical lines cut through the image. The pilot tapped the glass of his monitor. "Control, my sensor suite is experiencing significant interference. I am losing the feed on target west." In the Iranian mountains, Colonel Reza felt the vibration in the floorboards of the truck stop. The hum of the cargo had changed from a low drone to a high-pitched whine. Outside, the rocks of the canyon began to glow with a faint, ghostly luminescence. The technician screamed over the intercom. "The core is venting. It is not heat. It is something else. Sir, the air is thinning." The colonel looked out the window. The stars above the Zagros mountains seemed to bend and stretch. The mountain pass ahead of them did not look like solid rock anymore. It looked like water. 2:35 in the morning. The National Military Command Center. The atmosphere in the room was brittle. General Vance stared at the grainy, flickering feed from the Global Hawk drone. The 3 distinct shadows on the screen were moving with a predatory grace. One was climbing into the jagged peaks of the Zagros range. The other 2 were diverging toward the horizon. The general turned to the legal counsel, sitting at the edge of the light. "I need the rules of engagement. We have a non-attributed nuclear convoy moving in sovereign Iranian territory. They are using an unknown electronic warfare suite to blind our satellites. Does this constitute a hostile act?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses. His voice was cold and professional. "Sir, without a positive identification of the cargo, and kinetic strike is a violation of international law. We are not at war. However, under Annex 4, you are authorized to use non-kinetic measures to resolve the sensor ambiguity." The general nodded once. He keyed his desk microphone. "Control, this is the National Military Command Center. Authorize Raven 4-1 to engage target west with the high-output electronic pulse. I want that masking field dropped. I want to see what is inside that truck. 2:40 in the morning, over the Zagros Mountains." The pilot of the Global Hawk felt the weight of the command. He adjusted the frequency on his primary electronic attack pod. This was a weapon of pure energy. It was designed to fry the circuits of any unshielded electronics within a 50-meter radius. The pilot spoke into his headset. Control, I am in position. Slaving the pulse generator to the synthetic aperture radar. Targeting the lead vehicle of target west. Engagement in 10 seconds. On his screen, the digital crosshairs settled on the black void moving through the canyon. The countdown reached 0. The drone released a massive burst of electromagnetic energy. The pilot watched the display. Pulse away. Impact in 3, 2, 1. Contact. Nothing happened. The shadow did not flicker. The truck did not stop. Instead, the interference on the drone's cameras intensified. A ripple of blue light moved across the canyon floor, expanding outward like a wave in a pool of oil. The pilot gasped. Control. The target is non-responsive to the pulse. It is absorbing the energy. I am seeing a massive thermal spike on my own wingtips. Something is reaching back. 2:43 in the morning. Inside the Iranian transport, the cabin was vibrating so violently that Colonel Reza could no longer read the instrument panel. The blue light from the cargo was now blinding. It was leaking through the seams of the heavy container. The technician was screaming, but the sound was muffled, as if they were underwater. The technician clawed at the air. The American drone just hit us with a pulse. The core took the energy. It is using it. Colonel. The containment is not failing. It is expanding. Colonel Reza looked at the mountain wall in front of them. The rock face was no longer gray and solid. It was translucent. He could see the veins of quartz and iron deep inside the stone. The road beneath the tires felt soft. He keyed the radio to the rest of the convoy. Stay on my track. Do not deviate. We are crossing the threshold. Outside, the mountain range began to hum. It was a sound that could be felt in the teeth. Far above, the Global Hawk drone began to lose altitude. Its engines were at full power, but it was being pulled toward the canyon by an invisible force. On the ground, an Iranian surface-to-air missile battery 5 miles away suddenly went active. The radar dish began to spin at twice its rated speed. The operators inside the radar van watched in horror as their screens displayed hundreds of false targets filling the sky. The commanding officer of the battery did not wait for orders from Tehran. He saw the American drone descending. He saw the lights in the canyon. He gave the order to fire. A single missile cleared the launch rail with a roar that shook the desert. The escalation had moved beyond words. 2:50 in the morning. Over the Zagros Mountains. The pilot of the Global Hawk drone saw the thermal bloom of the missile launch on his secondary sensor. It was a white-hot spike against the cooling desert floor. He did not have the luxury of a cockpit to feel the G-force, but his screens told the story of a high-speed interceptor closing the distance at Mach 3. The pilot spoke into his headset with forced calm. Control. This is Raven 4-1. I have a surface-to-air missile launch from the 5 o'clock position. I am attempting to deploy countermeasures, but the aircraft is not responding to lateral stick inputs. I am being pulled toward the target coordinates. In the control trailer, the flight surgeon watched the pilot's heart rate climb. The drone was trapped in a physical anomaly that defied the laws of aerodynamics. It was descending at a rate of 4,000 feet per minute, despite the engines being at full military power. The Iranian missile was not the only threat. The sky itself seemed to be collapsing toward the convoy. 2:53 in the morning. The Iranian Regional Command Center in Shiraz. The radar room was a storm of shouting and electronic alarms. The commanding general stood over the primary glass table, watching the chaotic data stream. Who authorized the launch? Confirm the unit. The junior officer was pale. Battery 6. The commander reported a visual on an American drone descending toward the restricted zone. He claimed it was a kinetic attack on the convoy. He acted on standing orders for the defense of the core. The general looked at the screen. The American drone was falling. His own missile was seconds from impact. If the drone was destroyed, the Americans would retaliate within the hour. He looked at the mountain pass where the convoy had vanished into the blue light. Get me the Supreme Command. Tell them the window is closing. We are at the point of no return. 2:55 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. The North Arabian Sea. Aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, the deck was a blur of steam and high-octane fuel. Two F-35 Lightning fighters were already hooked into the catapults. The pilots received the final launch authorization through their helmet displays. The flight lead keyed his radio. Guardian 161. Checking in. 2 aircraft. Mission is combat air patrol and suppression of enemy air defenses. We are heading into the box. The catapult fired with a violent jolt. The 2 stealth fighters cleared the deck and climbed into the night sky, their afterburners appearing as twin diamonds of purple flame. They were flying toward the Zagros Mountains at 1,500 miles per hour. Their mission was to protect the drone and, if necessary, neutralize the Iranian missile batteries. Inside the lead Iranian transport, the transition was almost complete. Colonel Reza could no longer see the dashboard. He could no longer feel his hands on the steering wheel. The entire world was a hum of deep, vibrating blue. The mountain wall ahead of them was no longer a barrier. It was a doorway of shimmering light. The technician was no longer screaming. He was whispering, "Colonel, the air. It is not oxygen anymore. I can feel the weight of it in my lungs. We are not in Iran. We are not anywhere." The colonel looked at the rearview mirror. He saw the flash of the American drone's pulse weapon hitting the rear of the convoy. He saw the Iranian missile streaking through the sky like a falling star. And then, he saw the mountain close behind them. 2:58 in the morning. The drone pilot in Qatar watched his screen go black. The missile had not hit the drone. The drone had simply ceased to exist on the sensor feed. The pilot sat back in his chair. His hands were shaking. "Control. I have lost the link. Raven 4-1 is gone. Not destroyed, just gone." The silence in the room lasted for 5 seconds. Then, every alarm in the trailer went off at once. 3 o'clock in the morning. The Iranian border. Guardian 161 crossed the threshold at Mach 1.6. Inside the cockpit of the lead F-35 Lightning fighter, the pilot's world was a digital construct of green and amber. He felt the heavy pressure of the G-force against his chest. His sensors were flooded with data. 3 Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries were active. They were painting his stealth skin with high-frequency radar. The pilot spoke into his mask. "Guardian 2. Slave your sensors to my track. If they launch, we neutralize the source." The wingman responded immediately. "Copy. Systems are hot. I have a solid lock on the primary radar array." 3 o'clock and 30 seconds in the morning. The Shiraz Air Defense Sector. The Iranian commander stared at the glass display. 2 ghosts were moving through his airspace at incredible speed. They were not responding to warnings. He looked at the empty coordinate where the nuclear convoy and the American drone had vanished. His screens showed a perfect circle of electronic dead space. The commander's hand hovered over the launch key. "Contact the convoy again. We cannot fire if our own men are in the blast radius." The radio operator's voice was high and thin. "Sir, there is no response. There is no convoy. There is only a hole in the mountains. The thermal sensors are reading 0 Kelvin. That is impossible." 3 o'clock and 1 minute in the morning. The American pilot saw the Iranian missile doors cycle open on the ground. He did not wait for orders from the carrier. He toggled his master arm to hot. The internal weapons bay of the F-35 began to move. The hydraulic hiss was masked by the roar of the engine. A long-range air-to-surface missile was ready for release. He spoke to his wingman. "He is opening the doors. Engaging now." "Confirm," the wingman said. "I am trailing. Weapons free." The pilot's thumb rested on the trigger. His heart rate was a steady drumbeat in his ears. Sweat stung his eyes beneath his helmet. He waited for the digital tone that confirmed a firing solution. The sky over the Zagros Mountains was a static-charged pressure cooker. 3 o'clock and 1 minute and 30 seconds. The Iranian battery. Commander received the final authorization from Shiraz. His finger tightened on the physical button. He looked at the screen one last time. Commander received the final authorization from Shiraz. His finger tightened on the physical button. He looked at the screen one last time. The 2 American fighters were seconds away from his launch ceiling. Both sides were committed to the first shot. The history of the region hung on a single millisecond of pressure. 3 o'clock and 1 minute and 45 seconds in the morning. Over the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian missile cleared the launch rail with a roar that should have been heard for miles. But as the projectile reached 200 feet in altitude, the sound simply stopped. It did not fade. It was cut off, as if the atmosphere itself had lost the ability to carry vibration. Inside the cockpit of the leading American fighter, Guardian 161, the pilot's helmet-mounted display did not just flicker. It went pure, blinding white. The pilot reflexively shielded his eyes. My systems are in full reboot. What is your status? There was no answer. The radio was a wall of smooth, featureless silence. There was not even the hum of background static. 3 o'clock and 2 minutes in the morning. The Shiraz Air Defense Sector. The Iranian battery commander stared at his console. The launch had been successful. The missile was supposed to be intercepting the American contact, but the radar screen was no longer showing tracks. It was displaying a geometric pattern of perfect, repeating circles that moved across the glass like a ripple in a pond. The commander looked out the reinforced window of the command van. He expected to see the streak of the missile engine against the stars. Instead, he saw a pillar of translucent light rising from the canyon where the convoy had been. The light was not coming from a fire. It was not coming from the vehicles. It was coming from the air itself. The missile he had just fired was suspended in the center of this pillar. It was not moving. It was not falling. It hung 300 feet above the desert floor, its rocket motor still burning with a blue flame that had been stretched into a long, thin needle of light. 3 o'clock and 3 minutes in the morning. Inside the F-35, the pilot felt a sensation of total weightlessness. His instruments were dark. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine had vanished. He looked out the canopy. The Zagros Mountains were gone. The stars were gone. He was flying through a void of shimmering, iridescent fog. He reached for the manual eject handle, but his hand stopped mid-air. He could not move his fingers. It was not paralysis. It was as if the air around him had become as thick as lead. He looked at the clock on his backup analog wristwatch. The second hand was vibrating. It was not moving forward. It was moving back and forth across the same millisecond. The pilot's heart was the only thing he could hear. It was a slow, heavy thud. Then, the world snapped back into existence. The sound returned with the force of a physical blow. The roar of the jet engine screamed back to life. The HUD flickered back to green. The pilot gasped, his lungs burning as they suddenly filled with pressurized oxygen again. He checked his altitude. He had dropped 3,000 feet in less than a second. Guardian 2. Status. Talk to me. The wingman's voice came through, jagged and terrified. I am here. I am here. What was that? Everything just stopped. The pilot looked at his radar. The Iranian missile battery was still there, but its radar was cold. The missile that had been launched was lying in the dirt 5 miles from the launch site. It had not exploded. It looked like it had been crushed by a massive, invisible weight. The pilot slewed his targeting pod toward the mountain pass. The blue light was gone. The heat signatures were gone. The canyon was empty. There was no smoke. There were no tracks. The 6 heavy transport vehicles and the American Global Hawk drone had vanished. In the center of the canyon floor, where the convoy had last been seen, there was a perfect circle of scorched earth. The sand had been turned into a sheet of black, volcanic glass. It was still glowing with a faint, residual heat. The pilot keyed his radio to the carrier. Control. This is Guardian 161. Engagement terminated. The target is gone. I repeat, the target is gone. There is nothing left to track. The response from the carrier was a long pause. Then, the voice of the tactical officer came through. It was shaken. Copy, Guardian. We see it on the satellite. Return to base. We are in a full stand-down. The sky over Iran was suddenly empty. The 2 American fighters turned toward the sea. The Iranian batteries did not follow them. Both sides were too stunned to continue the fight. They had just witnessed something that was not in any manual of war. 3:15 in the morning. National Reconnaissance Office Headquarters. Sarah stared at the high-definition feed of the Zagros mountain pass. The resolution was perfect. The air was clear. The moonlight hit the canyon floor with a cold, silver light. But the 6 heavy transport vehicles were gone. The Global Hawk drone was gone. There was no wreckage. There was no smoke from a crash site. There was only the perfect circle of black glass at the center of the canyon. Sarah spoke into her headset. Her voice was barely a whisper. Scan for debris. I want a wide-angle sweep for any metallic fragments or thermal blooms within a 10-mile radius. The technician at the secondary console shook his head. I am already running it. There is nothing. The radar logs show the drone and the convoy simply merged into a single coordinate. Then, they vanished from the spectrum. It was not a physical collision. It was a digital and physical erasure. 3:20 in the morning. The Pentagon. General Vance stood in the center of the National Military Command Center. He was surrounded by screens showing the global readiness status. The DEFCON level had been raised, but the room was strangely quiet. The reports coming in from the carrier strike group were nonsensical. 2 of the world's most advanced fighter jets had just experienced a total systems failure that lasted exactly 100 milliseconds. A strategic analyst approached the general. Sir, we are receiving a flash message from the Swiss embassy in Tehran. They are acting as the diplomatic link. The Iranian government is accusing us of using a subatomic displacement weapon. They believe we transitioned the convoy into another dimension. The general looked at the analyst. Tell them we did no such thing. We lost a $60 million drone in that canyon. We are just as blind as they are. 3:25 in the morning. Shiraz Air Defense Sector. The Iranian commander walked out of the command van. He stood on the cooling desert sand and looked toward the mountains. The pillar of blue light was a memory. The air felt unnervingly still. He looked at the wreckage of the missile that had fallen from the sky. It had not exploded on impact. It had been flattened, as if a giant hand had pressed it into the earth. The battery technician joined him. He was holding a handheld Geiger counter. Sir, you should see this. The radiation readings. The commander turned. Is the site hot? Did the core breach? The technician shook his head. That is the problem. The readings are 0. Not low. Not background. They are absolute 0. Every radioactive isotope in a 100-meter radius has been stripped away. The sand, the rocks, even the components of the missile. It is physically impossible. This area should have a natural background count. It is like the history of the atoms has been wiped clean. 3:30 in the morning. Over the North Arabian Sea. The 2 F-35 Lightning fighters approached the USS Abraham Lincoln. The landing was handled by the automated carrier recovery system. The pilots were too exhausted to fly the final approach. As Guardian 161 touched down and the tailhook caught the wire, the pilot felt a wave of nausea. He climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the flight deck. His wingman walked over to him. Both men were still wearing their flight suits. Their helmets were tucked under their arms. The wingman spoke first. Did you see it? Right before the screen went white. The pilot nodded. The mountain. It did not look like rock. It looked like a doorway, the wingman said, and something was waiting on the other side. The pilot looked up at the stars. For the first time in his career, the sky felt crowded. He realized that the mission had never been about the nuclear material. The material was just the bait. Something had been watching the convoy and the drone. Something had waited for the moment of maximum tension to intervene. 3:35 in the morning. The National Reconnaissance Office. Sarah found a single frame of data that the system had flagged as a glitch. It was from the millisecond before the satellite feed failed. It showed a shape in the canyon. It was not a truck. It was not a drone. It was a geometric shadow that did not reflect light. It was hovering 10 feet above the lead transport vehicle. She zoomed in on the shadow. The edges were not sharp. They were blurred, as if the object was vibrating at a frequency the camera could not capture. The watch officer stood behind her. What is that? I do not know, Sarah said, but the computers cannot classify it. It has no heat signature. It has no mass. It is just a hole in the data. The realization began to sink in across both command centers. The Americans and the Iranians were no longer the primary actors in the Zagros Mountains. They were spectators. 3:45 in the morning. The White House Situation Room. The digital clock on the wall was the only thing moving. The president sat at the head of the table. He was surrounded by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Director of National Intelligence. A secure video link showed the commander of United States Central Command. The room was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and cold adrenaline. The Director of National Intelligence spoke first. "Mr. President, we have confirmed the loss of Raven 4-1. The aircraft did not crash. It did not experience a controlled flight into terrain. It simply ceased to exist at an altitude of 12,000 feet. At the same moment, the Foreign Forces Convoy vanished from all orbital and ground-based sensors." The president leaned forward. "And the nuclear material? Where is it?" "We do not know," the director replied. "The foreign military are currently in a state of high alert, but their internal communications suggest they are just as confused as we are. They are searching for their own men. They are accusing us of using a weapon that we do not possess." The chairman of the Joint Chiefs intervened. "Sir, we have a report from the ground. The foreign forces teams at the site are finding zero background radiation. Not a trace of the uranium. Not a trace of the shielding. Even the natural isotopes in the soil have been stripped away. This is not a military capability. This is a physics anomaly." 3:50 in the morning. The mountain pass. The armed forces had cordoned off the area. Floodlights on portable towers cut through the desert darkness. They illuminated the circle of black glass. The officer's second in command stood at the edge of the circle. He was wearing a full hazardous materials suit. He held a high-frequency scanner. The officer spoke into his radio. "Command, I am at the center of the transition zone. There is no impact crater. There is no debris. But I have found something." "In the command center," the general responded. "Describe it." "It is a vibration," the officer said. "It is not a sound. I can feel it in my boots. The ground is humming at a constant frequency of 42 Hz. And there is a residue. A fine, metallic dust is settling over the glass. It is not reflecting our lights. It is absorbing them." The general looked at his science advisor. The advisor shook his head. 42 Hz is the resonant frequency of the Earth's crust in this region, but it should not be localized like this. Something tuned the environment to that frequency. Like a key turning a lock. 4 o'clock in the morning. National Reconnaissance Office Headquarters. Sarah was still at her terminal. She had stopped looking at the visual feed. She was now digging into the raw data from the satellite's infrared spectrometer. This tool was designed to identify the chemical composition of gases in the atmosphere. She flagged a spike in the data. "Wait, look at the noble gas readings." Right at the moment of the whiteout. The watch officer leaned in. "What am I looking at?" "Xenon," Sarah said. "A massive concentration of xenon-124. It appeared for a microsecond. Then it vanished. That isotope is incredibly rare. It usually takes a high-energy particle accelerator to produce it in those quantities." The watch officer straightened up. "Is it a signature of a weapon?" "No," Sarah said. "It is a signature of a vacuum. It is what happens when you pull matter out of our atmosphere and leave a hole behind." The military drone was not shot down. The convoy was not hidden. They were harvested. The room went silent. The word harvested hung in the air like a threat. It was no longer a question of foreign nuclear ambitions or American surveillance. The mystery had deepened into something far more ancient and far more capable. 4:15 in the morning. A message appeared on a secure server at the Defense Headquarters facility. It did not come from a foreign IP address. It did not come from a known adversary. The source was listed as non-terrestrial. The message contained a single string of coordinates. They pointed to a location in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the Mariana Trench. The text below the coordinates was in plain English. It was a single sentence. "The material has been neutralized. Do not follow." The crisis was no longer about a war between nations. It was about the realization that the world was being managed. Both sides had been stopped by a force that did not care about their borders or their bombs. 4:30 in the morning. The National Military Command Center. The message on the secure terminal did not trigger a hacking alarm. It did not bypass the firewall. According to the system logs, the text had simply materialized within the encrypted memory of the primary server. General Vance stood over the shoulder of the lead cybersecurity officer. The officer's hands were hovering over the keyboard, but he was not typing. The general broke the silence. Trace the packet. I want to know the point of origin. The officer shook his head. There is no packet, sir. There is no routing history. This text is not a file. It is a direct manipulation of the server's hardware. It is as if someone reached into the machine and rearranged the electrons to form these words. The Director of National Intelligence looked at the screen. The coordinates for the Mariana Trench were glowing in a soft amber light. The Mariana Trench is 7 miles deep. It is the most inaccessible place on the planet. If the nuclear material is there, it is beyond the reach of any nation's recovery team. It is essentially erased from the board. The general turned to the satellite desk. Status of the Iranian forces. They are standing down, sir, the analyst reported. The Iranian Regional Command in Shiraz has issued a general order to return to barracks. Their air defense radars are switching to standby mode. They are no longer painting our fighters. 4:45 in the morning. The Shiraz Air Defense Sector. General Tehran stood at the edge of the map table. He had just finished a direct, encrypted call with the Supreme Command in Tehran. The orders were clear. The mission was a failure, but the threat was gone. The nuclear core, the transport vehicles, and the 60 men of the elite guard unit had vanished into a hole in the world. The general looked at his radio operator. Have the Americans responded to our inquiry? Not directly, sir, the operator said, but we have intercepted a broadcast on the international emergency frequency. It is a burst transmission from the American carrier. They are calling back their aircraft. They are declaring the sector clear of hostile intent. The general felt a strange sense of relief, followed by a cold, hollow dread. The immediate war had been averted. The two superpowers had been seconds away from a kinetic exchange that would have ignited the entire region. But they had been stopped by a force that made their missiles and stealth fighters look like primitive toys. He spoke quietly, the eye that watched. The convoy did not belong to Washington, and it did not belong to us. 5 o'clock in the morning. The Zagros Mountain Pass. The last of the Iranian recovery teams were packing their gear. The circle of black glass was now cold to the touch. The humming in the ground had stopped. The air had returned to its natural state, smelling of dry dust and old stone. There were no tracks leading out of the canyon. There was no sign that 6 heavy trucks had ever been there. The second in command looked at the scorched earth one last time. He thought of the men who had been in those trucks. They had families. They had names. Now, they were part of a classified file that would likely be buried for the next 50 years. They had not died for their country. They had simply been removed. 5:15 in the morning. National Reconnaissance Office Headquarters. Sarah sat back in her chair. The screens around her were returning to their normal surveillance tracks. The satellite was once again providing a clear, high-resolution feed of the Middle East. She looked at the image of the empty canyon. The watch officer stood beside her. The mission is officially closed. The Pentagon is labeling this a localized atmospheric phenomenon combined with a technical malfunction of the drone. Sarah looked at the frame she had saved. The one with the vibrating shadow and the message. The one about the Mariana Trench. It does not exist, the officer said firmly. The server was wiped. There is no record of that text. We are going back to business as usual. Sarah knew he was lying. She could see it in the way he avoided her eyes. The crisis had resolved, but the world was different now. The professional masks were back on, the protocols were being followed, and the official reports were being drafted. But in the silence of the command centers, everyone was asking the same question. The morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the Iranian desert into a sea of gold. The immediate threat of a nuclear-armed Iran had been neutralized. The peace was preserved. But it was a peace dictated by an unknown hand. 10 o'clock in the morning. Langley, Virginia. 3 days had passed since the incident in the Zagros Mountains. The Central Intelligence Agency headquarters was a fortress of quiet activity. Inside a secure briefing room, the Director of National Intelligence sat across from a small group of senior analysts. On the table between them was a single, physical folder. It was marked with a red stripe. There was no digital copy of this file. The director tapped the folder. The official narrative is holding. The public believes a technical glitch caused the loss of a drone during a routine border monitoring mission. The Iranians are sticking to their story about a localized seismic event and a tragic training accident. Neither side wants to admit that 6 heavy trucks and 60 elite soldiers vanished into thin air. Sarah, who had been transferred from the National Reconnaissance Office for the debriefing, spoke up. "It is more than just a disappearance, sir. We have spent 72 hours analyzing the telemetry from the Global Hawk before the signal was severed. The drone did not just lose power. It was being dismantled at the molecular level while it was still in flight. The sensor data shows the titanium in the airframe was being converted into a stable isotope of carbon. It was being turned into graphite." The director looked out the window at the Virginia woods. "And the nuclear material. The 300 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. It is gone," Sarah said. "The specialized sensors on our underwater cables near the Mariana Trench detected a thermal pulse 12 hours ago. It was at a depth of 36,000 feet. The signature matched the decay rate of the foreign core, but the energy was being contained. It was as if the material was being placed into a deep freeze that would last for 10,000 years. We cannot reach it. No one can." 6:30 in the evening. Tehran. A private ceremony was being held in a small chapel near the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard. There were 60 empty chairs. There were no coffins. The families of the missing soldiers had been told that their sons died in a secret hero's mission against an American infiltration. They were given medals. They were given pensions. They were not given the truth. General Tehran stood at the back of the room. He watched the weeping mothers and the silent fathers. He felt a weight in his chest that no military rank could alleviate. He knew that his men were not dead in any conventional sense. They had been taken. They were part of a ledger that no longer belonged to the nation of Iran. He walked outside into the cool evening air. His second-in-command followed him. "The site at the canyon has been paved over, General. We have poured 3 feet of reinforced concrete over the black glass. The radiation readings remain at absolute zero. The scientists say the area is now the most sterile place on the planet." The general lit a cigarette. His hands were steady, but his eyes were weary. "We spent decades building a weapon to protect our sovereignty. We spent billions of rials to ensure that no one could dictate our future. And in 100 milliseconds, we were shown that our power is an illusion. We are children playing with matches in a house owned by someone else. Do you think they will come back?" the officer asked. "They never left," the general replied. "They have always been there. We just finally gave them a reason to turn on the lights." 8 o'clock in the evening. The Defense Headquarters facility. The final report on the shadow window was being shredded. The physical copies were being turned into gray confetti. The decision had been made at the highest levels of the American government. The incident would be treated as a ghost. If both sides admitted what had happened, the global order would collapse. The realization that a superior, non-human force was actively policing nuclear proliferation would render every treaty and every military alliance obsolete. The world would continue to argue over borders. The satellites would continue to watch the deserts. The pilots would continue to fly their patrols. But for those who had seen the blue light in the Zagros Mountains, the game had changed. They were no longer the hunters. They were the subjects of an experiment they did not understand. The silence of the aftermath was louder than the roar of the jets. The missing material was safe in the crushing depths of the ocean. The missing men were ghosts in a redacted file. The morning was coming, and with it, the return to the theater of human conflict. But the shadow of the window remained. 6 months later. Washington and Tehran. The files concerning the Zagros Mountain incident were now buried under 6 layers of highest-level classification. In the halls of the Pentagon, and the corridors of the Iranian Ministry of Defense, the term shadow window had become a whispered shorthand for the impossible. It was the moment the world realized that the ultimate high ground was not in orbit. It was held by an entity that did not sign treaties. It was a power that operated outside the boundaries of human politics. Strategic analysts had spent thousands of hours reviewing the final seconds of the global Hawk drone feed. They looked for a pattern in the blue light. They looked for a signature in the way the matter was disassembled. They found nothing that obeyed the laws of contemporary physics. The prevailing theory among the few who knew the truth was no longer about a secret American or Iranian weapon. It was about a targeted intervention. Someone, or something, had decided to enforce a hard limit on human nuclear proliferation. Modern warfare had always been a game of calculation. If one side moved, the other countered. It was a balance of known threats and measured responses. But the shadow window changed the math forever. The nuclear material was still at the bottom of the blast, deep sea location. It remained 36,000 feet below the surface. Its thermal signature was a steady and cold pulse that served as a constant reminder. Someone had decided that the humans in the desert were not ready for the fire that we're trying to build. The material was not destroyed. It was simply placed where it could never be used. Sarah stood on the balcony of her apartment in Northern Virginia. The evening air was crisp, and the lights of the city stretched toward the horizon. She looked up at the sky. She no longer saw a vacuum of empty space. She saw a laboratory. She thought about the 60 men who had vanished in that canyon. She wondered if they were still in the foreign mountain range, separated from this reality by a single hertz of resonant frequency, or if they were somewhere much further away, being studied as representatives of a violent and primitive species. There was no celebration in the intelligence community. There was only a profound and quiet humility. The United States and Iran had returned to their standard posture of diplomatic friction and regional competition. But the intensity of the conflict had shifted. The rhetoric was softer. Both sides were looking over their shoulders. They knew that the next time the line was crossed, the eye might not just watch, it might act again. The era of total human military sovereignty had ended at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in central foreign territory. The Pacific Ocean remained dark and silent. Far below the reach of any human submarine, the black composite container sat on the silt of the ocean floor. It was surrounded by a field of energy that distorted the very fabric of the water. It was a trophy of a conflict that had been stopped before it could truly begin. The radiation was contained. The threat was neutralized. The world was being managed by a custodian that remained in the shadows. Military history is usually written by the victors, but the history of the shadow window was written by the survivors and the observers. Humanity had been given a reprieve. It was a warning that the most advanced weapons were nothing more than toys in the hands of children. And whatever is watching from the dark between the stars is not finished with the experiment. The world moved on. The sun rose over the foreign mountain range, turning the jagged peaks into a landscape of red and gold. The salt flats remained empty. The circle of black glass was hidden under tons of reinforced concrete and a layer of fresh desert sand. But the truth was out there. It was buried in the depths of the sea and the silence of the classified files. The morning was quiet. It would remain quiet for as long as the shadows allowed.